We're looking at 1 Timothy 3, verses 8 to 13. The men that God chooses for service down through the centuries of biblical history have had one thing in common. They had hearts that were devoted to Him. God said about His servant Abraham that his heart was faithful before Him. God said about the boy David, who was destined to be king of Israel, that he was a man after His own heart, a man who would obey the will of God. King Jehoshaphat was a man who set his heart to seek after God, and Ezra, the scribe who led the first group of exiles back to Jerusalem after 70 years of captivity in Babylon, set his heart to study the law of God and to put it into practice. And so it is such men that God chooses to serve Him, men of integrity, men of purity, men of virtue, men whose hearts are totally devoted to Him. Let me ask every saved man present this morning, is your heart devoted to God? You see, if you are to serve God in this church or in any church, this is the kind of man you need to be. A man whose heart is devoted above all else to God. And when I say above all else, that is exactly what I mean. I know that we have different personalities. I know that we have different gifts and abilities. But one thing that should be the same of all saved men is that their hearts are devoted to God. The onus of this sermon is being heavily placed upon the men who might be chosen to serve in the office of deacon one day, or those who are serving at the moment in the office of deacon. However, that does not mean that the same spiritual qualities that are required of these men are not required of all the men and all the women who would serve God in this church, as we will discover later on. It must be understood that from the outset that the spiritual requirements and qualifications for a deacon are in no way inferior to those that are required of an elder. There are differences between the two offices. You will see from the lists of spiritual qualifications and requirements for eldership and deacons, there are two requirements that are mentioned about an elder that are not mentioned about a deacon. Elders are to be able to teach, verse 2 and verse 5. They are to care for the church of Jesus Christ. This signifies that elders are to exercise authority and to demonstrate loving care in the church. And to underscore the differences in the offices, we read in 1 Timothy 5:17, the elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honour, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. One phrase in verse 10 defines what is required of a deacon in the church. Let them serve as deacons. Deacons are to serve the church not as spiritual overseers. Their role is to serve in the practical duties of the church. The office of deacon is not an office of authority. It is rather an office of responsibility. The word for deacon and its related terms appear approximately 100 times in the New Testament. The word deacon describes a function as well as an office. John MacArthur is very helpful when he tells us that there are three usages of this word. Firstly, the original meaning of the word has to do with performing menial tasks such as waiting on tables. That definition gradually broadened until it included any kind of service. The root idea of serving food comes across in John 2 verse 5, where diakonos is used of the waiters at the wedding. Secondly, diakonos is used to refer to soldiers and policemen who carried out the orders of others. And thirdly, the usage of this word refers to the office of deacon. Such men are to be the model of spiritual service for everyone else. Now, there is only one discussion about the office of deacon, and it is in this passage that is before us, 1 Timothy 3, 8-13. And when you take the three usages of the word and put them together, it gives you a picture of the office of deacon. Deacons do menial tasks. They don't believe that it's beneath them to do menial tasks. They carry out the orders of others. They are models of spiritual service for everyone else in the church. The founding principle to the biblical office of deacon was instituted primarily to distribute to the poor widows in the church. And this was done so that the apostles and later the pastors and elders would be able to give themselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. And the initial founding principle of the diaconate is seen as encompassing the temporal matters of the functioning of each local church. The elders labour within the eternal realm, and the deacons work concerning the physical realm. Now, this does not mean there is no spirituality or godliness about them as they conduct their duties. With spiritual grace, they administer the business and practical affairs of the church. Deacons serve to relieve the elders of any general task when they are qualified and able to do so. They were not called to be a system of checks and balances for elders, but to be practical servants of the church. You see, the deacons are under the oversight and authority of the elders, just like everyone else. And the office in itself carries no authority. But in the functioning of the office, they carry an authority derived from the elders who oversee the deacons and maintain responsibility for the proper overall functioning of the church. Having said that, all authority comes from Christ. And even though diaconal authority is a borrowed and delegated one, nevertheless it's a very real authority. And so to summarize, a deacon is one who works alongside the elders of the church, implementing their preaching, teaching, and oversight in the practical life of the church. When Paul wrote this letter to young Timothy, it was some 30 years after the birth of the church on the day of Pentecost. And by this time, the church had grown and developed to the point where there was a need for official deacons. The deacons would serve as role models of spiritual virtue and humble servants for the members of the church. To ensure that those who would be given the office of deacons were worthy, Paul lists several qualifications and requirements that they must be measured against. And just like the elders, Paul does not major in the first instance on what they are to do, but what they are to be. So let's look at what a potential candidate is to be before he can be set aside by the church as a deacon. Firstly, his character, verse 8. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. The word dignified here can be translated serious or stately. It contains the idea of being serious in mind as well as character. A deacon must not be silly or flippant, one who makes light of serious matters. Although not a cold, joyless person, a deacon understands the seriousness of life and death issues. The word double-tongued is, in fact, one word in the original Greek and only appears here in the New Testament. Now, some think that it refers to gossip, a person who has not one tongue going but two tongues going at the same time. However, it would seem that a better interpretation of the word would be the term that the Red Indians used to describe the white man as a person who spoke with a forked tongue. Simply put, a deacon is not to be a man who says one thing to one person and then goes and says something completely different to another person about the same situation. A deacon's speech must be one of integrity, consistency, and honesty. A deacon must not be a man addicted to much wine. In other words, he must not be a man whose habitual practice is drinking wine. He is not to be preoccupied with drink, nor does he let it influence him. A man by the name of Erwin Woodworth Raymond wrote this piece of sound advice. If an individual by drinking wine either causes others to succumb to its temptation, then in the interest of Christian love he ought to forego the temporary pleasure of drink in the interest of heavenly treasure. A deacon must not be a man who's greedy for dishonest gain. He must not use the office of deacon to make himself rich. That was an important quality in the early church, as it is in today's church, because deacons normally handle the money of the church as part of their official duties. And the temptation is always there to steal from the church funds, just as Judas did. And so it's essential, therefore, that deacons should be free from the love of money that could compromise their honesty. Let's consider now a deacon's conscience. His conscience, verse 9. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. Paul uses the word mystery often when he refers to the revealed truth that was originally hidden, but which is now being revealed by God's grace. And the mystery of the faith is the New Testament revelation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. A deacon must hold this revealed truth with a clear conscience. That is, with a conscience that does not accuse him. You see, it's not enough to believe the truth. The deacon must live out the truth. A deacon must not have two personalities, one for church and one for everyday living. One that is purer than the driven snow on a Sunday, and one that is prepared to bend the rules on a Monday. The conscience is something that has been given to every person to warn him or her when they have broken the commandments of God. We know, don't we, that our conscience either excuses or accuses us. It either produces guilt, shame, or despair over sin, or it produces peace and joy due to righteousness. And so a deacon must hold the mystery of faith with a clear conscience. We need now to look at his confirmation in the first part of verse 10a, his confirmation. And let them also be tested first, then let them serve as deacons. I would suggest to you that this testing happens before the man in question is being considered for the office of deacon. However, it's not a one-off testing, but it's an ongoing approval in order that the deacon can serve the church. Paul turns his attention to the conduct of the deacon in the second part of verse 10 and in verse 12, his conduct. If they prove themselves blameless, let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. Deacons, no less than elders, must be blameless. The offices of elder and deacon do differ, nevertheless, the spiritual requirements are the same. Deacons must not have a blot on their lives, nothing for which they can be accused of that would bring shame to the gospel or to the church of Jesus Christ. Now, this does not mean that a potential deacon cannot have a past. We all have a past, don't we? But thank God that God in His wonderful grace saves us and forgives us our past. But what it means here, that his life since conversion has been exemplary. Paul reiterates another key element from the qualification given for elders. Deacons must be the husband of one wife. The Greek text reads, a one-man woman. They must not be unfaithful to their wives, either in their actual conduct with other women or in their minds. As with elders, the issue is not marital status, but sexual purity. Deacons are to be models of sexual purity. They're to be good managers of their own homes and their children. Again, just like the elders, the deacons must prove their spiritual qualities in the home before they're let loose in the church. And let it be understood that this qualification includes everything that has to do with the home. The management of money, possessions, in other words, everything that is associated with the home. Next, we need to consider the deacon's confidence in verse 13. His confidence. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. And the whole thrust of verse 13 here speaks about the confidence that the faithful deacon breeds among the people whom he serves. In other words, he will be held by the church membership in high regard. And those who serve God and His people well will be reserved for greater service. Listen to what the Master said to the faithful servant in the parable of the talents. Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Now, having said that, it doesn't necessarily follow that after you've served so many years as a deacon, then you become an elder. That is not the case. You may be a faithful deacon for many years, but yet lack some of the qualifications to be an elder. Having said that, elders and deacons that work well together are a blessing to the Church of Jesus Christ. We all want to hear those words from the lips of our Master, do we not? Well done, good and faithful servant. So then let us be faithful over the few things that He gives us to do while we remain here upon this earth. Let us serve Him with hearts of devotion. Let us follow the example of Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, who stooped to wash the feet of His disciples. Let us be servants of one another and of God. Now, perhaps some of you are thinking that I'm not going to touch on verse 11. But we're going to drop back onto the subject, which is something of a spiritual hot potato. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful on all things. The word for wife here can also be translated as woman or women. And the word is used 221 times and can refer to three situations that a woman might find herself in. Firstly, a woman of any age. It can refer to a woman of any age, whether she is a virgin or married or a widow. Secondly, it can refer to a wife. Thirdly, it can refer to a betrothed woman, a woman who has been engaged. Now, Greek scholars are divided as to which is the proper interpretation, and those who would try to institute the office of deaconess would favour the interpretation to be women, while those who do not favour the office of deaconess would favour the word wife. Now, I've got to say that I don't believe that Paul is speaking here about an office under the title of deaconess for a number of reasons. Firstly, the word gune, used in verse 11, should be translated wives, because it is exactly the same word that is used in verse 2 and 12 of the same chapter, and is without question correctly translated wives. Let me sort of try and read it to you in a way that we will understand. Look at verse 2 of chapter 3. Therefore an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one gune. Then go to verse 12. Let deacons each be the husband of one gune. And when we fall back on to verse 11, it says their gune likewise must be dignified, and so on. And so do you see what is happening here? While it's true, verse 11 is somewhat abrupt in its meaning, Greek grammar and consistent exegesis demands that the same translation for both words in the extended passage. Just as no one can use verse 2 to teach women elders, so no one can correctly use verse 11 to teach women deacons. Secondly, when we consider verse 12, it cannot mean women in the office of deacon, because it says that a deacon who is married must be the husband of one wife, one gune, exactly like the elder. Verse 2. Again, consistent exegesis demands that deacons must only be men. And thirdly, when Paul wrote this epistle, there was no Greek word for deaconess. However, if Paul had wished to institute the office of deaconess, he could have used the feminine word of deacon, which he does not. And the feminine usage of the word diakonissa was used in the 4th century when Rome created the position of deaconess. Fourthly, absence of any mentions of women deacons or any women office bearers in the New Testament further teaches against this position. Immediately, someone will bring up Phoebe in Romans 16 and verse 1. But they fail to understand that the same word used to describe Phoebe, diakonos, is the same word that was used to describe Jesus in Romans 15 and verse 8, and the same word to describe a minister in public government in Romans 13 and verse 4. And we would never dream of straining the interpretation of the word diakonos to mean that Jesus or a minister in public government or deacons in a local gathered church. The fact that Phoebe is described as a diakonos, a servant, a helper of many in Romans chapter 16 and verse 2, denotes she was possibly a wealthy person who used her riches for the advancement of the gospel and the good of her Christian brothers and sisters in Christ. The word diakonos is a word broadly used of any brother or sister in Christ who does a work of service and ministers to others in any way. However, Paul uses it here to refer to a male member of the church who holds the office of deacon. And so I believe that Paul is referring to the wives of the deacons in the first instance in verse 11. But I am prepared to give way that this word can also be used to refer to a group of women in the church who served the church not under the banner of an office, but simply because they were servants of Jesus Christ and the church. For example, those women who by their substance, in other words, by their money, by their riches, in Luke's gospel, supplied Jesus with his earthly needs. Like Phoebe, the servant of the church in Caesarea. Like the other ladies that Paul describes in Titus, who are to teach the younger ladies of the congregation the virtues of being good wives and mothers. And there are numerous ways that ladies can serve the church of Jesus Christ. Trainers of young women, Titus 2, 3-5. Trainers of young children, Proverbs 1, verse 8, Proverbs 6, verse 20. Skilled homemakers, Titus 2, 5. Skilled hostesses, 1 Timothy 5 and 10. And skilled visitors. Now, if ladies are to serve the local church as a servant, there is a list of spiritual qualities that they also need to portray. And we find these in verse 11. And so at the beginning of the verse, we find her character. Their wives likewise must be dignified. And so the wives of deacons and women who serve the church, Paul tells us, must first of all be dignified. It's exactly the same word that is used here to describe the male deacons. Let me remind you of what the word dignified means. It can be translated serious or stately. It contains the idea of being serious in mind as well as in character. A woman who serves the church must not be silly or flippant, one who makes light of serious matters. Although not a cold, joyless person, a woman who serves the church understands the serious issues of life and death. And so members of the church should hold such women in high esteem because of their spiritual devotion. 11b, her conduct, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. And so a deacon's wife and women who serve the church are not to be slanderers. And this word slanderer is often used to describe the devil, and can be translated devil. And the women who serve the church must be able to control their tongues. When I think about the damage the tongue can cause, my mind is carried away to the description that James uses concerning the tongue in James 3 and 6. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell. We all know that it only takes a small spark to set a whole forest on fire with devastating results. Likewise, it only takes one wagging tongue to start a fire of accusation and counter-accusation in the church, which oftentimes have devastating effects. And so, let none of us, men and women alike, be guilty of starting any fires of destruction in the church of Christ with our tongues. A deacon's wife and women who serve the church are to be sober-minded. And the word sober-minded means abstaining from wine, either entirely or at least from its immoderate use. Women who are to serve the church must at all times be sober-minded in order to exercise sound judgment. And last but by no means least, a deacon's wife and women who serve the church are to be faithful in all things. They must be absolutely trustworthy. And this qualification includes the idea of not serving the church in order to gain money. Women who are not faithful in all things, which includes the little insignificant jobs that are often not as not even noticed by other church members, cannot be trusted with this privileged service. It must be understood that every member of the church is to be involved in some form of spiritual service, whether they be men or women. We are all to be deacons of Jesus Christ and His church in the general term of the word. Simply put, we are all to be servants of Jesus Christ and His church. But I believe it is only male members of the church who measure up to the spiritual qualifications that Paul sets out here that can hold the office of deacon. Therefore, just as each of the parts of an engine must accomplish a distinct task to make a car run smoothly, and just as each player on a team must play a unique role in order for the team to win, so men and women must perform different functions in the church in order for the church of Jesus Christ to honour and glorify God. May God bless the preaching from His word.